So half of us, when we see snow, want to pick up snowballs and throw snowballs at one another, and the other half think that the world has come to an end, and then they cancel meetings and so on and so forth. And it's particularly amazing if you're English to come to a place that still works when there's snow. Because for the English, that's like a kind of impossibility, a place that actually works when there's snow. Because for the English, like snow is an excuse for everything to shut down and stop altogether. And I was slightly alarmed when the organizers said that the heavy snowfall today, maybe yesterday as well, had prevented some people coming. And this alarmed me because it reminded me of a friend of mine who went to Canada to give a presentation at about this time of year in a place a bit like this, except to get to his conference he had to go by a little plane, a kind of little Cessna, and this place was the back of nowhere. It was like a retreat. And when he landed, it was blowing a blizzard, and they only just made it in. And when he woke up in the morning, the whole place was engulfed in snow, and they had this amazing blizzard, one of the worst blizzards they'd had for decades. So my friend gets up, comes down, has breakfast, comes to the conference hall, big place, takes 600 people, and there's one person in the audience. So that one person has managed to make it through all the snow and all the rest of it. And so my friend thinks, what shall I do? So he gets up and he gives him presentation. PowerPoint, all the rest of it. Audience loves it. At the end, gives him a standing ovation. The one guy stands up and claps him. So he thinks this is fantastic. So my friend gets down from the stage, and the guy in the audience stops him and says, wait a minute, where are you going? And my friend said, I thought I'd go back to my room and have a hot shower and frankly warm up because it's freezing in here. And the guy in the audience says, you can't go now, I'm the next speaker. So I am really pleased to see you all and indeed to have an audience. So Johannes and the organizers asked me to say a bit about where I thought innovation was coming from. And the first thing that strikes me is that innovation has become a bit like a religion, really. I mean, it's not just a way to come up with new products or services or technologies. It's something that people almost kind of believe in as a kind of religion. So there are key texts like Bibles, Wired magazine. Wired magazine has been proclaiming a revolution every month for about 15 years. There are the key texts of business writers like Clayton Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma, of IDEO, the design firm. And there are places like this. This is TED. I've given 2 TED talks. I've had a fantastic time at TED. But TED now has had 1 billion downloads of its talks. It's like a kind of church. It's like a kind of meeting of a congregation with people kind of spreading the word, and at other conferences like PopDeck. And if that is a church, then this is a kind of cathedral. Because look at it, it's kind of soaring. It's meant to inspire you. It's flooded with light. It's completely beautiful. And the really funny thing about going to an Apple store is that it's mixed with a mixture of awe, these amazing things. They're like relics or artifacts or kind of holy objects, reverence, and pure greed. Because everyone wants their kind of thing and they don't want to be trapped in the queue. Who here has got an Apple product? So virtually the entire room. Is there anyone here who's got an Android phone? Wow, a few brave holdout people open Android low-cost phones, whereas all us suckers with our overpriced and frankly not very good Apple phones. I'll come back to Apple, but just a couple of things about this. The first thing about this is, I mean, also true of the Android phone, this is really a tracking device. We think it's a phone, but actually it's a tracking device because it's constantly keeping track of what we're doing and where we are. And we think it's a phone, but actually it's something else altogether for the people who give it to us. But the really amazing thing about these things is the way they kind of create a conversation with you. And when I go into an Apple store, the conversation they create is I look at them and they say, you may be bald, middle-aged and overweight, but if you buy me, you will feel cool. And every time an Apple product says that to me, I buy it. And so that is the kind of trick that they have pulled off in this kind of cathedral. So if that's a kind of cathedral for innovation, then this is the patron saint. This is the kind of founder of the faith. And sure enough, here he is unveiling a miracle. Because each time he took to the stage and unveiled, I mean, can you remember seeing the MacBook Air? I mean, I remember seeing the MacBook Air and thinking it was impossible that a computer could be so thin. I remember the first time I used an iPod and the idea that you could just have music on this thing with no sort of physical correlate of it. It was just a digital thing. Or, of course, swiping your fingers across a tablet on which the truths are delivered. So the point about this is just that innovation is becoming a kind of secular faith, a kind of faith in the future. And one of the things that you need for innovation is you almost need faith, because you need to believe in things that do not yet currently exist. And you need to persuade other people to invest in them as well, to make them come real. So you have to almost make a leap of faith and hope that the future will redeem that by what you do. So the reason that innovation is so sort of compelling is that it's constantly managing our relationship with the future. And in a world where so many sources of hope and possibility seem to have become corrupted or disappointed, this seems to offer us hope. Well, where does that come from, that kind of stuff? Well, one story about innovation is that, of course, it comes from really creative people. People like this, Thomas Edison in his lab, Menlo Park, the lone inventor. The truth is that even Thomas Edison was highly collaborative. He always worked in teams. He was very itinerant. He moved from place to place. But we took this message that innovation comes from special individuals, special people working in special places, and we built places like this. This is one of the kind of beating hearts or nerve centers of the European economy. This is Philips's research facility in Eindhoven, and this was the center of Philips's industrial empire, built on its version of the light bulb. And when I visited 10 years ago for the first time, it was still surrounded by barbed wire, on the grounds that you needed to keep other people out and you needed to keep the Philips people in and their ideas. Now the barbed wire is gone, the security gates have gone, and Philips has opened it up. And the reason Philips has opened it up is that it's kind of realized that innovation is the creation of recipes that deliver better solutions, and that those recipes usually come from collaboration. And the more you can collaborate intelligently with a mix of different people, the more creative you'll become. And the more that you need other people's skills and assets to turn an idea into reality, the more you'll need to collaborate as well. So the future, really the history, but certainly the future of innovation, is going to be all about organizing that kind of collaboration. Well, where will these kinds of new innovations of the future, where will they come from? That is almost a sort of ridiculous question to even try to answer, because here is probably the most important rule about that, which is it's almost impossible to spot. And if you think you know the answer, it's almost certainly partly going to be wrong. Why? Because radical innovation, innovation that really changed the world, rarely comes from mainstream players. It rarely comes from big companies, big organizations. It invariably comes from people working in margins with few resources who see the world in different ways and use their own sort of fragility and their own small size, their nimbleness, their agility, their lack of resources as an advantage. And so my basic prediction about the future is that there will be rapid, continual, often disruptive innovation, and often it will come from completely left field. That is not entirely new. It's been a feature of the capitalist economy for quite a while. So take as an example Ryanair. Where did Ryanair start? Ryanair, Europe's most successful, profitable airline, started with a 12-person flight from Galway to Paris. There's absolutely no reason why Lufthansa or Aer Lingus would ever have spotted Ryanair. Who would have looked to the Galway to Paris route as the place where a revolution which would upend the European aviation industry would start? But that is where Ryanair started. The container. The container's done as much as the iPhone, more, to revolutionize our world. The container and containerization has done more to lower transport costs, increase trade, and spread opportunity and wealth than virtually any other technology by creating a world economy driven by trade. And it's been absolutely the key, core, basic technology of much of that trade. Where did it come from? The container came from a man called Malcolm McLean, who was a trucker, and he was fed up of all the roadblocks on the way from his base in Houston up to New York. And so he took a World War II tanker called the Ideal X. He cut down 2 disused cranes. He built his own container, and the Ideal X sailed on May the 1st, 1956. It was the first container ship, came from a complete maverick, came from an outsider. Or take as another example, organic salad. Now, I don't know what the situation is in Austria or Germany, but in Britain, it used to be you could only buy one kind of lettuce, really, called iceberg. The iceberg lettuce, dull, predictable, crunchy, tasteless, by and large. And that was the only kind of lettuce you could buy. And then about 10 years ago, our shops started to fill with these bags of organic salad, organic Italian leaves, in various kind of shapes, sizes, tastes, and all the rest of it. Where did the idea of the bag of salad come from? The bag of salad came from a couple called Drew and Myra Goldman. And they were graduate students in California, and they had 25 acres of land. And to feed themselves, they grew fruit and salad. And when they had left over, they sold it to a local restaurant. When the local restaurant changed hands, they were left with a lot of unused salad. And Myra, being kind of frugal, had been used to putting the salad in a plastic bag and then putting the salad in a fridge and eating it later in the week. And she said, well, why don't we just do that with the rest of the salad and take it round to shops? That is how the organic bag of salad was born. On Earthbound Farm, 25 acres of rented land in California. Now, that couple, Drew and Myra Goldman, run 137 farms, and they are the biggest salad producers in the world. It didn't come from the mainstream, it came from left field. So, in the property business or the building business, where assets are more important, money is more important, this may not be so quite in the same way. But in the economy that's around you, more and more change will come from unlikely sources. No one in the music business saw Sean Fanning and Napster and the way that it would eventually upend their entire business model. No one at Encyclopedia Britannica spotted Jimmy Wales and Wikipedia. No one at Microsoft or Google spotted Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. So innovation is this sort of constant process of some people seeing opportunities and others overlooking them, ignoring them, or turning their back on them. And when that happens in an economy in a big way, when there are lots of disputes and uncertainties of that kind, some people see opportunity, others people see threat and risk and downside, then you get opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation. And entrepreneurs go into that space. They're not frightened by it. They go into that space which is deeply uncertain and make something of it. And it's amazing how quickly that cycle can change. Chester Carlson. Chester Carlson was chief scientist at Kodak. And working away in his lab in his own time, he invented this thing which he took to the board, and he showed the board of Kodak, and he said, look, I've invented this thing, and you take a picture and you close the lid and you press a button and lights flash, and out the other end comes a perfect copy. I'm going to call it a photocopier. And the board of Kodak said, that's interesting, Chester, but we don't think anyone is really going to want a photocopier, and anyway, we're in the film business. So Chester Carlson took that idea, created Xerox. Xerox created an entire industry. 17 years later, Steve Jobs comes to Xerox and says, look, I've invented this thing. It's got a keyboard and a screen, but most importantly, this little box. I'm going to call it a personal computer. And Xerox said, that's very interesting, Steve, but we are in the photocopier business, and we don't think anyone is going to want one of your funny computers, because I don't know if you've noticed, but computers are big mainframe things that sit in the middle of big companies. So that process of guarding against the complacency, short-sightedness, closure that comes with being a big company is one of the most difficult things to do. But if you want to innovate, it's one of the most important, especially if you are a big company. So where will the innovations, these cumulative, collaborative, unfolding things, where will they come from? Let me just give you 4 ideas and 1 model to think about the future. The first is that innovation will have to become increasingly frugal. And by frugal, I mean it will have to do its job with few resources. It will have to create products and services which are relatively easy to acquire and relatively easy and costless to maintain. Why is that so? Well, that is so because in Europe and in most developed world markets, the impact of austerity, I think we are just, at most a third of the way through. I think we'll be living with austerity, and middle-class consumers particularly, who've been the driving forces of consumer growth, they'll be living with austerity for at least another 7 years and possibly another decade. And so the market for things which do a good job but at a reasonable price, I think will go up. The second force is the environment and environmental carbon and other pressures, which will mean that resource use will become extremely expensive. And all around the world, resources are becoming more expensive. There's more conflict over them, and they're becoming more important. And finally, and most importantly, the big markets in the world are in cities like Karachi or Mumbai or Sao Paulo, where you've got millions and millions of young but relatively poor consumers who want efficient and effective but basic versions of things that work for them. And they aren't that interested in paying extra for brands or extra functionality. They want very basic things. And so let me give you just one example of the kind of product that we'll see more of, this brick. So I got this brick about a month ago in Mexico from a company called Echale de Casa, which means build your house. And Echale de Casa have a machine which is a bit like a cappuccino machine, but very big, that it can transport on a back of a pickup truck, and it can take to villages. And villages can, with a mixture of a little bit of concrete and local mud, put the mud into the machine, pull a handle, and out pop 4 bricks. Well, if you leave 4 machines in a village for 3 days, the entire village, who are probably living in wood huts or with tin roofs, can make enough bricks to build 8 or 10 houses. So this is a perfect example of something that's very lean and simple, It doesn't require masses of training. It doesn't require lots of technology. It's a very simple machine. It's shared, so it only really makes sense if the whole village is involved. And it uses largely recycled materials. It uses the earth in the ground. So far, Echali de Casa have built 40,000 homes in Mexico. They're going to spread across Latin America. But they are part of a movement in the developing world, which is essentially to provide technologies that help people do things themselves at very low cost to provide solutions. Lean, simple, shared, social, recycled, and reused. Those, I think, will be the watchwords of technologies in the future. Don't invent it, recycle it. Don't own it yourself if you can share it and lower the cost. Don't make it complex if you can make it simple. Make it low cost to acquire and low cost to maintain. And if you want to see the future of that, just look at what these things are going to do to healthcare. So if you look in the developing world, if you look in India as a prime example, in India, all across India, people are experimenting with these things as substitutes for doctors and nurses. So if you can't build a hospital, if your population is too poor and dispersed, how do you nevertheless get decent healthcare to them? Well, you can turn this into a hemoglobin monitor. With the right software, you can turn this into a scanner that will scan a woman's stomach when she's pregnant. If you design it in the right way, you can deliver drugs using a sachet, a bit like a ketchup sachet at McDonald's. The most important thing to deliver to a mother when she's just had a child and she's bleeding is oxytocin. Oxytocin needs to be delivered in our countries with a needle and with a solution that needs to be kept in a fridge, for which you need electricity. In the developing world, they've developed a spray that you can deliver with a simple pipe that's low cost and doesn't need a fridge, and doesn't need a doctor or a nurse. So the future of healthcare, if you think about the future of healthcare, you think about how much of our economies are wrapped up in expensive healthcare solutions, hospitals, doctors, nurses, procedures, technology. In the developing world, where they have none of that, they're going to have to invent solutions which are much lower cost and much more effective, and they will do that by following these principles. Keep it simple, keep it shared, and reuse things. So how do you design for that? Well, I suppose the basic underlying kind of thrust, I suppose, of these kinds of technologies is to not look at the technology, but look at what people use them for and why it's important to them. And the reason it's important to them is that these technologies give people power. They give people a sense that they are being addressed by something that works for them, and they can then do something with it. They can make a change, even if it's only very locally to their lives. So the technologies and the companies of the future who understand that, I think, will be very successful. And to understand that, let me give you just one way of thinking about it, one analogy, which is to think about wine, not technology, not that kind of technology, but wine. So the English are terrified of French wine. The English find French wine deeply, deeply alarming. The experience of going into a French restaurant and ordering wine for the English spells one thing, and it spells a kind of humiliation is looming. Because for the English, the sort of, well, first of all, you've got this choice between red and white. Then this sommelier comes, and you know that the arrival of the wine waiter, the sommelier, is just a sign that you're going to be sort of publicly embarrassed and shown to not really know what you're doing. So then you decide, okay, I'll go for red. And then you think, none of these names mean anything to me. So I am not going to go for any of the top 5 because they are cheap and that will make me look cheap. I'm certainly not going to go for any of the bottom 10 because those will bankrupt me. So I'm going to go for something in the middle, and I am simply going to pick a name that sounds nice. That is basically how the English choose French wine. And then the sommelier comes along and you sort of smell it and taste it. I've never seen an English person send any wine back They wouldn't know how to do that, I don't think. And the reason that French wine is so alarming for the English is the kind of conversation it sets up. Because the French wine bottle says to the English, hello, I am Chateau Latour Lafitte, and I come from an appellation. You won't know what that means because you're English, but I come from an appellation called Saint-Julien-Estèphe. I was made in 2007. I am 13% volume of alcohol, and that is all I am going to tell you. And if you don't understand what that means, I suggest you go on a course or get a very, very big book and leaf through it, and then you'll find out where I come from. But as far as I'm concerned, I am not going to say another word to you. And so, of course, the English kind of reel in horror. So that was the way wine was for, decades, really. It was a source of embarrassment. And then something rather dramatic happened. The Australians arrived. And so the Australian bottle of wine, at least in Britain, this is what it does. The Australian bottle of wine, first of all, it's called something like Cloudy Bay or Lovely River, or it's like somewhere you want to go. Then it tells you what grape it is, Sauvignon or Chardonnay, which to English ears sounds a bit like a girl with blonde hair from Essex and a sort of short skirt and high heels. So that sort of sounds kind of vaguely attractive. And then it says, I was made in 2007, but you don't need to look up the year because I taste the same year in, year out. I never really change because I can guarantee how I taste. And then instead of that sort of complicated cork thing, it's got a handy screw top. And the handy screw top says to the English, look, you can put me in the fridge and unscrew me and pour yourself a glass and then you can put me back. Simple. Except the English, of course, never do that. They just sort of take it out and pour a bit and then take it out again and finish the whole bottle. So, but the key thing about the Australian bottle of wine is what it says on the back. Because on the back it will say something like, taste the luscious varieties and the deep autumnal flavors that come from the organic land previously farmed by Aborigines, now overlooking the glorious vista. And by the way, I go very well with Thai green curry. So you can never imagine a French bottle of wine saying the words Thai green curry. It's just not part of its lexicon. But the Australian bottle of wine will make itself available to you and say, in effect, what are you eating? Oh, Thai green curry. I go very well with Thai green curry. In other words, what it's saying to you is, I fit into your life. I will adjust my language, how I work, the technology to use me, all the rest of it, so it's easy for you to accommodate me in your life. Whereas the French bottle of wine says there are certain conditions that must be met before I'll have anything to do with you. So this is the kind of shift, because this stuff, for my kids, the idea of an instruction manuals are dead. I mean, any technology that needs an instruction manual is just toast. Because my kids want to use things within about 45 seconds. And if the thing is designed so they can't use it really quickly, then they'll just give up. I mean, it's just not for them. So in other words, you have to design things these days with an eye to how you fit into other people's lives. But what's really happening, if you want to sort of understand this stuff and think about wine, the real thing that's happening is not just that the Australians have arrived, and the Californians and the New Zealanders and the Chileans, but what's happened is that some people have started winemaking kits, and they've started giving people vines and vineyard kits and presses and bottling machines, and some people are getting together and making them together, and most of it's completely undrinkable, but some of it's quite good. So now what you have is you have a French high-end industry, some of which is doing better than ever before. You have this insurgent new wine industry which has opened up the market like never before, and you have all these people making their own stuff. That's what our culture is now like, thanks to all this technology. So where can you be in that? Well, if you're at right the high end, if you're really, really good, if you're one of those very top, if you're Chateau Petrus or whatever, that's fine. You'll be better off than ever. If you're in the middle of the French wine industry, you've just been decimated. If you're the Australians, you might succeed, but to be the Australians and the Californians, you have to look at the industry from a completely new point of view. So how did they do that? Well, it really all started with Robert Mondavi, 1968, in California. And Mondavi did not say, I want to make the best wine in the world, I'll go and copy the French. Mondavi said, how do I get people who currently drink Coke, bourbon, coffee, and beer to drink wine? How do I create a wine for them? In other words, he targeted people who weren't currently wine consumers. So the message of that is that radical innovation comes from people who see the world in different ways. They take a different vantage point. And the really important vantage point that those people took is to see how they could give people power. Give people choice, give people tools, give them a sense that this product was for them and fitting into their lives and they could do other things with it. So the third thing is that the really impressive people are going to be the people who don't just create products, but they create entire systems. So the significance of this is not just that it's a beautiful thing. There are lots of beautiful things. The significance of this is that it's part of a much bigger system. So I have a 1972 Olivetti Valentine typewriter. It was designed by an Italian designer called Soppas. It is the most beautiful typewriter in the world, in my view. But my Olivetti Valentine typewriter is completely simple, and it's completely untricky in the sense that all you can do is type. So this is a beautiful tool as well, and you can do lots of things on this. Take photographs, record video, play music, you name it. It's a tool, but it's also part of a much bigger system. Because the really important thing about this is what it links you to. Put it this way, Steve Jobs was often early. So sometimes he arrived early with a product like the Apple Newton, which was ahead of its time. But with this and with the iPad, the iPod, he arrived late. So Apple was not the first company to come along with an MP3 player. That was a South Korean company. By the time that the iPod came out, there were already several hundred thousands of MP3 players in America. Apple was not the first company to come up with a smartphone. They'd been around for ages. Apple came at least 2 years late to that market. Why did it arrive late? It arrived late because it wanted a product that was there when all the other things that you need around it, the software, the services, the music, the interface, the way to download stuff, was already available, because without that, the product isn't very valuable. So what makes this valuable is all the apps that you can constantly refresh it with. Where does that come from? It comes from Apple understanding halfway through the process of getting this scaled up that people using it would add content to it, and that would make it more valuable. So in other words, the really successful people will not just create great products, they'll create also the systems and services that go around products that make them really useful. And to do that, you have to build alliances. And to do that, you have to share value with people. You have to create ways that they will also get some value out of the common platform that you are creating. So time and time again, as you look into the future, systems will trump products. Systems will trump buildings. Buildings are less important than the systems that connect them to all the other things that make them really valuable. And so that then raises some problematic and troubling issues, perhaps, about what our relationship is with these systems. And I suppose the way that I would sum that up is that the systems of the future, powered by these technologies, will increasingly have a very, very intimate relationship with us, and we with them. And all that you need to do is understand a bit of how we currently interact with them and roll that forward 10 years to see what that might be like. So it's very striking sitting here watching you all come back in, having talked to one another over coffee, and then virtually everyone who came in formed an intense experience, almost like they were praying, with this thing in front of them. I remember sitting in a restaurant in Dubai, watching a family, all men it has to be said, sitting down to a meal, and none of them were talking. They were just all communicating with their devices like this. So if we have formed such a kind of intimate relationship with these things, where will we allow or want that to go in future? And particularly when these things increasingly connect us to these social networks in which we're constantly sharing news and views and updates and other things about ourselves with lots of other people. Who here is on Facebook? So of those people who are currently on Facebook, how many people trust Facebook? So like half the room's on Facebook, but no one trusts it. So this is our problem, which is that our lives are becoming kind of enmeshed with these things which make them work, but actually we don't really fully trust them. That's slightly troubling. I have a very sort of ambivalent, episodic relationship with Facebook. It recently sent me one of those messages. It said, you've lost touch with Geraldine Bedell. You should reconnect with her, which was extremely helpful of it, because Geraldine Bedell is my wife. And, you know, we still sleep with one another, and generally, when I'm in London, have breakfast together. But for Facebook, because we hadn't been interacting on Facebook, that meant somehow that, of course, we didn't have a relationship. So in other words, these are very clumsy things, because Facebook sees information which is incapable of understanding social context. But increasingly, that's going to change. And increasingly, the most impressive innovations and technologies are technologies that will support relationships. And so one way of thinking about it is the dilemma that we will face going forward is all this technology for us, or are we for it? Do we channel our lives into the formats, templates, status updates, and all the rest of it that they provide? And do we provide it with data that feeds it, or is it really helping us do things which are valuable to us? I'll give you a tip. If you use any kind of web-based, open source, cloud service like Gmail or Facebook or what have you, just send a message to yourself saying, I was very sorry to hear of your loss. I'll see you at the funeral next Wednesday. I guarantee within a day you will get adverts popping up somewhere on your web presence offering you various kinds of funeral services. Absolutely true. So this is the sort of dilemma that we face, which is we're heading really for a world where we're going to live increasingly with systems, but these systems will increasingly want to have very intimate and personal relationships with us, and there will be a payoff for us because we'll get better services and a more sort of responsive kind of services from companies, but the cost is we'll share a lot of our lives with them. So this is some of what I think will happen. The technology will increasingly disappear. So, you know, the first mobile phone was like this big. Now it's this big. It slips into our pocket. Well, why shouldn't it be in our pocket in the first place? Or why shouldn't it just be on our ear or part of our clothing or just all around us? So this technology is going to disappear, and one of the ways it will make itself acceptable to us is that it will just feed into the environment of our lives, and it will become part of the sort of ambience, if you like, part of the wallpaper. So that's one thing that I think will happen. A second thing that I think is already happening is that these technologies are ways to lower the costs and the risks of forming relationships. So if you think about the revolution in dating that has come about through online dating with all these algorithms, what that is essentially saying is that the risk of making a relationship and wasting an entire evening on someone who's a complete loser, we can eliminate that risk because of some algorithms and data which will give you a better chance. So all over the web, actually, there are things like that which are ushering you into groups and relationships and networks which its analysis or the algorithms behind it suggest might be better for you. So they'll be better at understanding where you're placed. They'll be better at understanding what you mean. So if you type in the word Nashville, it will understand whether you mean the town in Tennessee, the film, or the town in Utah, also called Nashville. So it will become incredibly or increasingly able to spot context and meaning. And gradually, human minds and bodies will become infused with these things. So if you watch the Paralympics was a kind of vision of the future. Because if you're wealthy and 85 and you've got a bad knee or a bad hip or a bad arm, well, why wouldn't you in future have it replaced with something prosthetic which did a much better job and expanded and extended your quality of life? If your memory is failing and through neuroscience and implants your brain could become brought back to life, why wouldn't you do that? So I would say where we are now compared, if you throw that forward to 10 years where we could be, our relationship with all this technology will have become more powerful, it will be doing more for us, and yet it will be more enmeshed in our lives, and we will find it harder and harder to get away from. And that's the sort of dilemma. And that, I think, is a kind of new connection between us and technology. Not just technology as tool, but technology almost as part of who we are, which I would think will be a reality in some shape or form in about 10 years. It will start becoming stuff that's absolutely normal for people to talk about. So that's quite scary, and one might wonder, well, how would you make all that work? And it's rather alarming, but actually living in a world which is increasingly connected, and you're always part of networks in which you have to get things done by sharing and connecting with other people, is a possible way of thinking about the future. And let me just give you one model for thinking about how that works, and it's this lot, Barcelona Football Club. If you want one way of thinking about the future, every time you confront a problem, just think to yourself, what would Barcelona Football Club do? Because Barcelona Football Club, it seems to me, are the sort of apogee of the high point of collective creativity. Because the English, as you know, play football almost like a form of class warfare, where you have sort of big defenders at the back who can't really play football, but they can boot the ball up, and then sort of attackers at the front who are kind of skillful, but they won't really work very hard. And they will just sort of wait for the ball to come back to them when they've lost it. And they wear white boots and they've got hairdos and smoke and stuff like that. And the sort of English football is played, as you know, in straight lines. It's a kind of like a railway game. You know, it kind of goes up and down and then maybe across occasionally and then up and down again. So in the 1970s, this hacker comes along called Johan Cruyff in a complete backwater, Amsterdam, not the centre of world football, but a backwater. And Johan Cruyff, like all great innovators, asks a controversial question. And the controversial question is, what if all 11 players could actually play football? And not just the people at the front, but actually all 11 of them could play football, and they could control the ball, pass it, move it, dribble, and kind of everyone could be involved all at the same time in a kind of seamless flow, and they called it total football. Cruyff, Ajax, the Dutch team, fell out with his mates, goes to Barcelona. The current Barcelona side is the absolute kind of high point of this idea that creativity and power are a collective capability. And the more connected you are to the right people, and the more talent and skill those people have, the more powerful you will be. But there's a rule to that, which is you will not win unless you pass. You cannot win entirely on your own. There are brilliant talents like Messi, but by and large, you have to keep passing, and you have to explore space together. And if you're not open to being passed to, you won't get the ball. And if you won't pass it once you get it, no one will give you the ball again. So to win in this game, you have to pass, and to create that network, you have to kind of trust one another. So the reason that Barcelona is so good is they do things like this. They look like Morris dancers or folk dancers. They should be wearing lederhosen, but they are dancing around playing the ball together. Or they look like this, which is a bit like a kind of male ballet. So they're training like dancers, almost. And at Barcelona, they train them over and over and over again in these techniques, so that they know where everyone else is. And that's what creates a kind of seamless creative network, where the creativity is embedded in the capabilities of all the people in the network. So if you want one final lesson then, to innovate in this world shaped by these things and the connections that they make, it is think like Barcelona. And the Barcelona message is, you will not win unless you pass. You will not win unless you pass. That, I think, is the best way to prepare for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I really liked your football picture. Because
it's funny that because people from
all
Austria
of us
and
can
Germany
remember the old English kick and rush style that maybe is still in place.
It's not maybe still in place.
Yeah.
It is still in place.
And so the question is, would there be different areas where you would say it's still more the old English kick and rush football style? Let's say, for example, governments, public organizations, and there are other fields where more the Barcelona style is in place. Would you see these fields, and how would you describe them?
Broadly speaking, not kick and rush style maybe, but broadly speaking, if you think about the way that the English set about playing football, it was like a pyramid with a goalkeeper, 2 fullbacks, 3, and this kind of very hierarchical notion, skill up here, kind of, brawn here. And these people, Barcelona and others, they play in a way that everyone is skilled together. So these pyramidic things are often features of hierarchical, public, older organizations that want this big separation of who's creative and who's not. And these things emerge in new spaces, civic organizations, social media, new technology, new entrants, increasingly will adopt that form. They will look more like that than they will look like that. And part of the world is about the contest between these two different ways of playing what is in essence the same game, but playing it in completely different ways.
Well, as far as I can understand, this is not a field where you can act with sort of change it in a day. It are sort of transformational processes that would need driving forces. What are the driving forces? Could be angst, of course, German angst. Well, crisis, we have to change. Probably it's not the best way to try?
Well, crisis, I think, is vital in a lot of innovations. So generating a sense of crisis is really vital. I think that curiosity is very important, just going and looking and seeing. I would say the most important thing is to learn to see the world in new ways, to adopt different vantage points. And the vantage point of the outsider, the underdog, the maverick, someone with no resources will give you a different vantage point from the world, from someone who's powerful but trapped. And I work with a lot of people who, in essence, in big companies or in government, say, I'm really powerful, I've got all this money and all this responsibility, and I'm completely trapped and I don't know what to do with it.
And what is your advice?
Well, my advice is that they need to work out how to take steps in a measured way to keep on providing what people want whilst continually experimenting with new ways to do things. And unless you're putting some bets out here and opening up your organization in new ways to new people and new ways to do things, and challenging conventional wisdom, having the confidence to challenge conventional wisdom and accept that there will be some degree of kind of conflict as a result of that, you won't change, or you won't change fast enough to really keep pace with that kind of change.
So that's one of the big questions. For example, also in the media businesses now, would you rather suggest to try to, let's say, implant the curiosity of taking other standpoints into a given organization, even if it's powerful, or would you rather suggest to do the new things in new organizations parallel, and then in the end try to get the synergies of both?
It can work both ways, and it can also fail both ways. So most big organizations, media, knowledge, information organizations, whether they're libraries, cultural organizations like museums or newspapers, there is this kind of civil war going on of people saying, look, this is what we know how to do. We know how to make broadcast television. We know how to publish books, make films, lend books to people. We know that it's declining, but that's what we do, and we know how to do it, and maybe we can continue doing that. And then other people saying, no, over here is the new way that everyone wants to do things, but this requires a completely new way to work. So at the end of the day, this organization doesn't transform itself and survive unless it starts taking in some of these new ways to do things into its core business, into its core way of doing it. Whether they start outside to get more air, or whether they start in the fringes inside is then a more sort of tactical discussion.
Last question. There's one deliberate room, and that means really room, where we decide whether our next generation will be able or curious enough to do so, and that is school and education. What is your view on the educational systems that you know for the time being? Are they capable of what they would have to do with young people?
I think the young people are endlessly capable, and the education systems are often completely dysfunctional, is what I would say. So all around the world, people want education and learning, and all around the world, people are deeply disappointed by what it delivers. And they're deeply disappointed because it sort of hits the target, passes the exam, but somehow misses the point. And for me, the point of education systems should be to spot and develop talent, basically. They should be talent systems. And what they are is kind of exam machine passing systems that sort of often squeeze talent and capability, creativity and imagination out of people. So I think the biggest crime in the world in some ways is just the sheer waste of talent in our mainstream education systems. And what's happening to young people is that where they once didn't have an alternative to that, they couldn't see that there were different ways that they could do and learn and be and search and share. Now they know that they've got masses of alternatives. And they do it as soon as they get home and they get their iPad out.
That's the positive part about it, because they are not that much reliable on the classic system as they used to be.
Yes, so that is the positive part of it. So I mean, the best way to think of it, I think, I mean, all the people that I know who've kind of worked in schools and created, is what you really want is you want the best of the very old system. So you want a very personal education, quite argumentative, discursive, with passionate and imaginative teachers, and very social, and the best of the new, using these digital tools, and you squeeze the middle, which is the industrial teacher classroom knowledge transmission. So you sort of squeeze that to the minimum, and then you open up these spaces where actually learning can be much more engaging emotionally, relationally, personally, and much more creative, because you're doing things with your friends and others using these tools, and maybe you're doing it outside school as much as you're doing it inside school, and maybe you're doing projects together as well as passing exams. So the place in the world that I think is best at that I have seen, is this network of schools in California, in San Diego, called High Tech High. And I'll just give you one glimpse of High Tech High. High Tech High, they regard the children as producers, not just consumers. So the children go to school to make things. And amongst the things that they've made is that the children at that school have published 53 books on the courses that they study. So if you want a guide to physics year 10, there is a guide written by one of the students. So imagine a school that you went to be a producer, not just a receiver. That would be the basic pitch. What would that look like?
Thank you very much.